She struck me before she even spoke, a sharp, desperate slap that left more fear than pain. And as my keys fell to the porch between us, something else slipped from her coat pocket. A folded letter she tried to hide with her shaking foot. I didn't know then that the truth inside it had been waiting for years to find me. Tell me where in the world you're listening from. I love seeing your cities and countries in the comments. It reminds me how far these stories travel. I have lived in the same small house on the edge of town for nearly 40 years, long enough for the wood to remember every step I ever took. My son visits when he can, and his wife, Mara, usually stays quiet around me. Polite, distant, unreadable. Winter had begun to settle into the roads and windows when everything shifted on a morning that smelled of frost and burnt coffee. I opened my door expecting silence, not violence, and certainly not a secret trying to claw its way into the light. The slap was only the start. The letter she carried told a story she wasn't ready to speak aloud. I always thought winter mornings were the gentlest part of the year. Soft light, slower breaths, a kind of hush that settles over the house before anyone else wakes. That morning was no different. Frost clung to the edges of my windows like lace someone forgot to finish. The kettle hadn't warmed yet. The hallway still smelled faintly of last night's fire. I opened the door expecting the usual quiet, the kind that makes you feel like the world is still deciding what kind of day it'll be. Instead, I found Mara standing there, with her breath shaking into the cold. And before I could even say her name, her hand rose. I had never seen her like that. Mara was the kind of woman who always kept her voice folded neatly, like the napkins she placed under every cup of tea. But that morning, something in her had come undone. The sky behind her was the pale gray of early winter, the kind where the sun doesn't bother announcing itself, just slips into the day without ceremony. Her eyes were swollen, rimmed red, like she hadn't slept or had been crying far longer than she meant to. Her coat hung off one shoulder, one strand of hair stuck to her cheek, frozen there by the wind. She didn't greet me, didn't ask if she could come in. She just stood on my porch as if the earth beneath her feet wasn't steady anymore. I gripped the edge of the door with one hand and the keys with the other. I wanted to say something gentle, something that would soften whatever storm was brewing behind her eyes, but the words didn't come fast enough. "Morning, Mara," I began, and then she stepped toward me, fast, sharp. Her palm cut through the cold air with a sound that felt louder than it should. For a moment, neither of us breathed. The slap wasn't the kind meant to hurt. Not really. It was the kind that comes from fear or panic or something deeper. A breaking point wrapped inside a gesture you don't think through. My cheeks stung, but it was the look on her face that struck harder. Her mouth trembled, opened, closed. She swallowed something she didn't know how to say. My keys slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the wooden boards between us. The sound was small but sharp, like the house had whispered, "Be careful now." She stared at them as if they were the last thing holding her together. "Give me the keys," she said. But her voice didn't match her demand. It stretched thin, barely holding its own weight. "Mara, what's going on?" I asked gently. I bent to retrieve them, but she stepped closer, her boots landing heavy on the boards, edging too close to the edge of her own control. "Just give them to me." She blinked hard. "Please." I felt the urge to reach for her wrist, steady it, warm it, but something about the way her fingers twitched told me to keep still. As I bent toward the keys, a small white corner slipped from her coat pocket. A folded letter, soft around the edges, like it had been handled too many times. It fell silently, landing against the shadow of her shoe. Her foot moved instantly, covering it, not casually, not by accident, like she had to protect it from the air itself. She knelt faster than I expected, grabbing the keys in one hand and the letter in the other. Her movements were clumsy, rushed, as though she feared I might snatch one or the other from her. "Mara," I whispered. "Look at me." But she didn't. She kept her eyes on the frozen boards, the keys rattling softly in her shaking hand. Her breath hitched again, forming little clouds that rose and disappeared just as quickly. I watched the letter, creased, yellowed, edges frayed, as she shoved it deeper into her coat like she was hiding a bruise. "I didn't want to come here," she said, her voice breaking through the cold, "but I didn't have a choice." Her words hung there between us, fragile and unfinished. She stood again, but her shoulders curled inward, as though she were bracing for something I couldn't see. She held the keys tightly, almost painfully, like she needed them to anchor herself. "What do you need them for?" I asked quietly. She flinched, not from the cold, but from the question. For a moment, I thought she might answer. Her mouth parted, a soft breath escaped. Her eyes lifted just enough for me to see the fear swimming beneath them. But instead of speaking, she turned her face away, as if the truth was too heavy to hand over in daylight. We stood there for a long moment, the cold settling around us like a third presence. My porch light buzzed faintly above us, flickering every few seconds, a weak heartbeat in the early morning hush. Mara finally stepped back, gripping the keys, her coat pressed tightly over the letter she didn't want me to see. The frost beneath her boots cracked softly as she shifted her weight. "I'll explain later," she whispered. "Just not now." She turned and walked down the steps before I could stop her. The sun tried to rise behind the clouds, but its light felt thin and uncertain, the kind that can't quite warm a day that starts like this. And as she disappeared down the path, I couldn't shake one question. What could a letter possibly hold? That someone would hide it with violence. The letter hit the porch so softly, I almost missed the sound. Just a thin whisper of paper against wood. But Mara moved fast, faster than I'd ever seen her, as though the wind itself might steal it away if she didn't get to it first. Her fingers closed around it before I could breathe in the cold again. She shoved it deep into her coat like someone hiding a match still burning at the edges. For a moment, the world held still. The frost, the porch boards, even the breath between us. Only the letter seemed alive. Alive in the way secrets sometimes are. The air that morning had that pale winter brightness, the kind that never warms, only reveals. I could see everything too clearly, the way her shoulders shook, the way her boots left small crescents of frost with every shift of her weight, the way her coat pocket bulged now, hiding something that didn't seem meant to be carried. Something about that paper tugged at me. The edges looked softened by time, the folds worn, like it had been opened and closed by hands that struggled with the choice each time. And the color, that pale, almost yellow tint, it brushed against a memory I couldn't place, a memory that stirred somewhere low and deep. Mara kept pacing along the narrow stretch of my porch, tracing the same 3 boards again and again. She didn't look at me, not once. Not even when the wind slapped her hair across her cheek or when her coat slipped down her shoulder again. She just kept moving. I stood there, holding my own hands like they might steady the moment. The cold crept up my sleeves, tugging at the quiet between us. "What is it you're so afraid of?" I wanted to ask. But the words stayed inside. Some moments are too fragile for sound. I finally took a small step toward her, careful not to break the thin ice forming in the silence. My voice came out softer than I intended. "Mara, talk to me." She stopped pacing, but only for a breath. She turned her back to me, fingers digging into the pocket where the letter was hidden. I watched her shoulders rise and fall too quickly, like she was trying to breathe around something too large for her chest. "Give me the keys," she said again. Same words as before, but quieter this time. Less command, more plea. "I just want to understand," I whispered. She shook her head hard, hair swinging, brushing frost from her coat. Her breath trembled. The letter crackled faintly under the pressure of her grip. A brittle sound that made my stomach tighten. She was holding it too tightly for something that delicate. My eyes traced the corner of the pocket where a thin line of paper peeked out. Something about that soft corner, that color, that fold. It pressed against the back of my memory like a knocking from long ago. "Mara," I tried again, "why are you hiding that letter?" She froze, and in the stillness the world seemed to hold its breath. The trees beyond the porch, the cold air around us, even the sky above that refused to open fully into the day. She didn't answer, but she didn't have to. Not yet. The fear in her fingers told me enough. When she finally turned around, her face was pale, not from the cold, but from something inside her, something that looked like dread. "It's nothing," she murmured, tightening her coat, pressing the letter deeper. "It's nothing you need to see." The lie floated between us, thin as her voice. Mara was never good at lying, even in the small things, telling me she wasn't tired when she clearly was, saying she didn't mind missing dinner when her stomach growled loud enough to hear. Her eyes always betrayed her. Now, they wouldn't even lift to meet mine. "You came to my house with a torn coat, swollen eyes, and a letter you hide like a wound," I said softly, "and you expect me to believe it's nothing?" She flinched, not from my words, but from her own fear of them. The wind brushed past her, tugging at her hair, but she didn't move. She stood there, caught between wanting to speak and wanting to run. "I need the keys," she whispered again. "Please." "Why?" I asked. Her lips parted, then closed again. She pressed her palm flat over the pocket, as though the letter might leap out and reveal her secret without permission. Her silence felt heavier than any confession, and in that moment, watching her, watching the way she protected that folded page, I realized something had shifted. Whatever Mara wanted inside my house, it wasn't small, it wasn't simple, and it wasn't for her alone. She stepped away from me again, her boots cracking the thin frost that had formed in the minutes we stood there. Her breath came out in small, trembling bursts, each one rising into the cold and disappearing before it reached the edge of the porch. I stayed where I was, feeling the weight of the keys still warm from her earlier grip. The morning light had shifted just slightly, catching the edge of her coat pocket where the hidden letter pressed against the fabric. She turned her head a fraction, not enough to meet my eyes, but enough for me to hear the strain in her voice. "I'm begging you. Just trust me. Give me the keys." She wasn't asking for metal in her hand. She was asking for something much deeper, and the question lingered in the cold air between us. What truth was she so desperate to face inside my house, and so terrified for me to see? The house felt different the moment she crossed the threshold, as though it exhaled after holding its breath too long. Winter light slid in through the doorway behind us, settling across the floor in thin strips, revealing dust I hadn't noticed and footprints I didn't hear her make. Mara stepped inside slowly, like a traveler entering a place she'd only ever seen in stories she didn't trust. Her coat brushed against the frame, the sound soft but trembling, like fabric afraid of being touched. I closed the door gently behind us, and the quiet wrapped itself around us both. It was the kind of quiet that remembers everything. I hadn't planned on letting her inside, not after the slap, not after the trembling hands and the letter she guarded like it was stitched to her skin. But the cold outside felt sharper than usual, and something in her eyes, something cracked and raw, made me step aside. The house was dim, the way it always was in the early hours before the lamps had the strength to fight off winter. Photographs lined the hallway, their frames slightly crooked from age. A quilt my mother made hung near the kitchen door, faded from the years but still warm in the pattern she stitched by hand. And beneath it all was the pine scent that had lived in these floors longer than I had, a scent that clung to every memory I stored here. Mara moved past me without a word. Her boots made almost no sound on the wood, as if she feared waking something that slept in the shadows. Her shoulders were tight, her coat pulled close, the letter hidden beneath layers of fabric like a bruise she didn't want seen. She stood still for a moment near the stairs, breathing in the air of the house, as though measuring how much of herself she could let out without breaking. "Take your time," I whispered. She didn't answer, but her fingers twitched, like the words pressed at her and she didn't know how to hold them. Mara began to walk, slow and hesitant, touching the house in careful fragments, never fully, always with the gentleness of someone expecting the floor to shift beneath them. Her hand drifted along the banister first, the wood worn smooth from years of palms sliding over it. She paused halfway up the first step, tracing a small scratch carved into the rail. My husband made that mark the day we moved in, right after dropping the toolbox between his feet. I wondered if she could feel that memory through her fingertips, the way certain scars in wood hold warmth long after the moment is gone. Then she turned back toward the living room. Her gaze caught the window frames, the ones my son painted years ago. Uneven edges where he rushed the corners, wanting to prove himself more grown than he was. Her fingers hovered there for a second, brushing the dried paint like she was looking for a message left behind. She stepped deeper inside, toward my late husband's chair, the one by the fireplace, the cushion slightly sunken, the blanket draped across the back. Her breath caught. She didn't sit. She just stared at it as though expecting someone to be there. "Mara," I said gently, "you're walking like you're looking for something." She turned away quickly, pulling her coat tighter across her chest, shielding the letter from view. "Maybe I am," she whispered. Her voice cracked slightly, the words falling like small pieces of something she hadn't meant to drop, but she didn't pick them up. She moved into the dining room next, the room with the old wooden table that still carried faint knife marks from years of family dinners, celebrations, quiet arguments no one spoke about later. Her hand drifted across the table's edge, following one of the grooves left behind by my late husband's steady but impatient chopping. She paused there, tapping her fingers lightly, as though trying to remember something she had never witnessed herself. I watched her back rise and fall, each breath tighter than the one before. Her shoulders trembled once, barely noticeable, the kind of tremble people have when they're holding too many memories that aren't theirs. She kept her face turned away from me, but I could see the tension in her jaw, the way she swallowed and swallowed, trying to steady herself. Her coat pulled tight again as her hand slipped instinctively to her pocket. To the letter she wouldn't let me touch. The letter she guarded was like a secret someone had stitched to her ribs. "Mara," I whispered, taking a careful step closer, "tell me what you think you'll find here." Her breath faltered. "It's not what I'll find," she murmured. "It's what I'm afraid is already here." She finally turned her head, just slightly, enough for me to see the sheen in her eyes, the fear softened by grief. "What memory do you think this house is hiding?" I asked. She closed her eyes, pressing her hand deeper against the letter. "One I didn't know existed," she said quietly. "One I'm not sure I'm ready to face." The air shifted then, not louder, not colder, just heavier, like the house understood something I didn't yet. We stood in the heart of the house, surrounded by quiet reminders of lives lived and moments that had gathered like dust on the shelves. Mara kept her hand pressed to her coat, guarding the letter that seemed to pulse with a history she didn't know how to unravel. She looked around slowly, her gaze drifting across the walls, the stairs, the chair, the frames, as if each one whispered a name she couldn't yet say aloud. "I didn't come here to hurt you," she said, voice barely above a breath. I didn't know where else to go." I nodded, though she still wouldn't meet my eyes. The house creaked softly, old wood shifting, old memories stirring. Somewhere deep inside its walls, a truth waited, and Mara seemed terrified that it might recognize her first. The steam from the kettle drifted upward in thin ribbons, curling into the dim kitchen light before disappearing like it had somewhere more important to be. I poured Mara a cup first, out of habit, not hope, and she wrapped her hands around it even though the tea inside barely trembled. She didn't bring the cup to her lips, didn't even try. Instead, she stared at the tabletop, at the faint knife scratches that had lived there longer than she had. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to pull something old and buried straight up from the floorboards. Just one name, a name I thought time had swallowed whole. It had been years, decades, since I'd heard that name spoken aloud. Hearing it again was like hearing a door open inside a house you thought was empty. Something tightened low in my chest, a familiar ache I thought I'd tucked away with letters, photographs, things too fragile to leave out for the world to touch. Mara didn't seem to notice the way my hand paused mid-air, or how the kettle whistled one last soft note before settling into silence. She kept her eyes fixed on the table, tracing a fingertip along the grain of the wood. Her shoulders were hunched forward, not in anger this time, but in something that looked almost like apology. The kitchen felt small around us, the walls a little closer than usual, the air a little heavier. Outside, the winter light pressed faintly through the window, washing her face in a cold, muted glow. It made her look both older and younger at the same time. I leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth from my own cup seep into my palms. The name still echoed in the space between us, settling into the quiet like it had always belonged there. Finally, I found my voice. Mara. Where did you hear that? She didn't answer right away. Her fingers tightened around the letter in her lap instead, knuckles white, trembling. Whatever storm she walked in with hadn't left. It had only shifted. She lifted her gaze just enough for me to see the fear behind it. Not the wide-eyed, frantic kind. A quieter fear. The kind people carry when they realize the past they thought belonged to someone else has begun tapping on their own door. Did he ever live here? She asked. Her voice cracked on the last word, the way old floorboards crack when you step on the wrong spot. I felt the air between us stiffen. I took a slow breath. He did, I answered softly. Once. Mara swallowed hard. She didn't ask anything else at first. Didn't ask how long he stayed, why he left, who he was to me. Instead, she just held the letter closer, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. I watched her thumb rub small circles over the fabric of her coat, right where the paper hid beneath it. The circles grew tighter, faster. Why? I asked gently. How do you know his name? She shook her head, not in refusal, but in confusion, like she didn't know how to begin pulling apart the threads inside her. I found it, she whispered. Written in my mother's things. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't even think it was real until today. Her voice trembled, and suddenly the pieces didn't add up. Not in any way that made sense. Her mother, that old name, the letter. Something was stitching them together, and she was barely holding on to the edges. I leaned forward slowly, my palms flat on the table, the wood cool beneath my skin. Mara, I said quietly, let me see the letter. She recoiled before she even realized she'd moved, pulling the paper so tightly against her coat it rustled. No, she said. It wasn't harsh, just broken. Her breath shuddered out in small clouds. Her eyes shimmered in the weak winter light. For a moment, she looked like a child standing in a doorway she didn't want to enter. It's not just a name, she whispered. It's a story, one I think my mother was trying to bury. And now it's here, and I don't know what to do with it. She finally looked at me, and the pain in her eyes wasn't anger or guilt or even fear. It was recognition. The quiet kind people feel when a truth begins to surface and they realize they are no longer just holding it. They're part of it. Mara, I said again, softer this time, why would your mother keep this name? Why bring it to you now? She shook her head again, but this time tears threatened to spill over. "I don't know," she said, "but I think you do." The words hung there, not accusing, not cruel, just honest. Her hand trembled around the letter, and for the first time, I understood. This wasn't only about her mother's past, it was about something that connected us, something that had been waiting in the shadows of this house longer than either of us realized. I looked down at my untouched tea, at the steam fading away like a memory losing its heat. The name she'd spoken still rang inside me, steady as a heartbeat. Across the table, Mara held the letter like a shield, or a confession. Outside, a faint wind brushed against the window, rattling it gently, like a reminder that time doesn't stay still just because we want it to. I met her eyes again. "That name," I whispered, "carries a story I never meant to open again." She clutched the letter tighter. "And my mother," she said softly, "left me holding the end of it." The house seemed to settle then, its old bones creaking, as if it recognized the truth before either of us dared to say it aloud. The attic door groaned when I pulled it open, the kind of sound old wood makes when it's forced to remember. Dust drifted down in slow spirals, catching the thin sunbeams that slipped through the small window, like fallen ash. I held the railing as I climbed, feeling each step tremble beneath my weight, as though the house was warning me to tread lightly. Behind me, Mara followed with hesitant footsteps, the kind of steps people take when they aren't sure if they should keep going or run back down the stairs. When we reached the top, the stillness settled around us, thick and heavy. Even the air felt older up there. Older than her. Older than me. The attic had always been a place I avoided, unless I needed something too stubborn to throw away. The ceiling sloped low. The boards creaked with every shift of weight. The walls held the scent of pine and forgotten winters. But that morning, with Mara standing beside me, the space felt different, almost alive. Sunlight filtered through the grimy window, falling in narrow bands across the floor. They stretched all the way to the stacks of boxes in the corner, their cardboard edges softened by years of heat and cold. "This way," I murmured, though my voice felt small in the lofted quiet. She didn't answer. She kept her coat wrapped tightly around her body, one hand pressed against her pocket, fingertips touching the folded letter like it might dissolve if she let go. Her eyes weren't on the dust or the boxes or the old furniture covered in sheets. They were searching the shadows, looking for something she wasn't sure existed or something she hoped wouldn't. We reached the corner where the old belongings sat. A few boxes, nothing more. Taped carefully, labeled in handwriting only I could recognize. His handwriting. That familiar ache fluttered in my chest again. "Mara," I said softly, "you don't have to." "I do," she whispered. But her voice didn't carry strength, only fear. I knelt beside the boxes and pulled the first one toward me. The cardboard scraped the wooden floor, stirring up dust that danced briefly in the air before settling again. Mara crouched next to me. Her breathing was too shallow, too quick, like she was bracing for a truth she already suspected. "This belonged to him," I said quietly. Her fingers hovered near the box flap, hesitant. When she finally lifted it, the scent of old paper and worn fabric drifted out. Fragile things that survive long after the people tied to them disappear. She reached inside and pulled out a small item, a photograph, face down. She turned it over, and the moment her eyes met the image, she closed the box again, quickly, almost violently. Her hand shook as she put the lid back on. "I can't," she whispered, pushing the box away as though distance could soften whatever the picture showed her. I watched her chest rise and fall in uneven waves. Her face was tight, but not in anger, in something far more fragile. "Mara," I said gently, "you don't have to look at anything that hurts you." Her jaw trembled. "It's not the picture," she said, even though her voice betrayed her. "It's everything behind it." She pressed her palms against her knees, grounding herself. I sat beside her in silence. Sometimes silence is kinder than questions. She stood slowly, stepping away from the boxes, but the light from the window caught her face in a way that made her look suddenly younger. Too young to be carrying the kind of weight I saw in her eyes. She turned toward me, her coat shifting slightly, revealing the faint outline of that folded letter through the fabric. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Her voice quivered around the edges, like a sheet of paper someone had folded too many times. I nodded. She swallowed hard before speaking. Why would something from my mother's past be found in your home?" The attic felt colder then, not from the winter, from the question. It landed between us with the heaviness of truth, trying to unbury itself. I took a breath, slow and unsteady, because I had asked myself the same question the moment I saw the letter in her pocket. Because there were things I hadn't spoken aloud in decades, things I thought time had claimed and the house had quietly sealed away. "Mara," I said softly, "your mother never came here, at least, not in any way I knew of." She closed her eyes, nodding like she expected that answer, but dreaded it all the same. "Then why," she whispered, "does it feel like she left something here for me to find?" Her voice cracked. The attic held the echo gently, as though it had heard such things before. She looked around slowly, the boxes, the dusty beams, the low ceiling, and the expression on her face shifted from fear to recognition. Like a story she didn't know she was in suddenly began to reveal its shape. We stood there together in the attic, surrounded by dust, memories, and the faint hum of a house too old to pretend it didn't know us anymore. Mara hugged her coat closer, the letter pressing against her heart. The sunbeam near her feet thinned as a cloud drifted across the sky, dimming the room just enough to blur the colors of the past. She looked at me, truly looked, for the first time since she arrived that morning. "I think she was trying to tell me something," she whispered, "something I'm still afraid of." I nodded, the house creaking softly beneath us as though agreeing. Whatever truth waited inside this home, it wasn't finished revealing itself. We moved back downstairs slowly, as if the house itself wanted to keep us in the attic a little longer. The steps creaked beneath our feet, old wood remembering old stories, and each groan trailed behind us like a faint warning. When we reached the bottom, the warm light from the living room settled over us both, softer than the attic sunbeams, gentler than the truth waiting in Mara's coat. She stood in the quiet room, fingers trembling as she loosened her grip, and for the first time, the letter slipped far enough into the light for me to see the handwriting on the front. One glance was enough. It felt like my heart forgot how to move. The living room had always held a certain hush, the kind that settles after years of steady living, after stories once spoken too loudly soften into whispers. The lamp beside my late husband's chair glowed faintly, casting pale gold light onto Mara's hands as she pulled the letter from her pocket. She laid it on the coffee table but didn't release it completely, her fingertips holding the edge as if letting go might pull something loose inside her. My eyes fell to the envelope. The script was unmistakable. It slanted gracefully, looping at the ends, the ink fading in places like it had been folded away for too long. Time had pressed creases into its surface, softening the corners, but the handwriting— I knew it the way people know their own reflection, not by shape, but by the ache it stirs. My breath hitched. The room wavered slightly, not from dizziness, but from memory. A memory wrapped in that very handwriting. "It was hers," Mara said softly, "my mother's. I found it in her drawer after she passed." She didn't finish the sentence. Loss rarely needs full sentences. I blinked, trying to steady myself. "Your mother kept this?" I whispered. Mara nodded, her hands curling slightly as if pulling warmth from the letter she still half held. "All these years," she murmured, "sealed, unread, hidden. She closed her eyes. I think she was afraid of whatever was inside. I lowered myself onto the edge of the couch. The fabric felt cool beneath my palms, a small grounding against the rising tension I didn't yet want to name. Mara stepped closer, finally placing the letter in front of me, not handing it to me, just setting it down, like someone offering something sacred to an altar. "Do you recognize the writing?" she asked quietly. I could only nod. Words felt too fragile. The name written on the front, the one meant to receive the letter, wavered in my vision. My name, clear, deliberate, as if the writer had taken his time. I traced a finger lightly above the ink without touching it, a habit from years of treasuring things too delicate to hold. "It was meant for you," Mara said, or maybe not just for you." I lifted my gaze to her. "What do you mean?" She fidgeted with her sleeve, swallowing tightly before speaking again. "I don't think she ever meant to keep it," she whispered, but once she realized what it was, she didn't know how to face it. Her words trembled at the edges, like the letter's seal. "She never mentioned knowing him," I said slowly. "She didn't," Mara whispered, not out loud. The winter light outside dimmed as clouds drifted past, softening the room even further. She took a deep breath, tightening her hold on her coat as though bracing herself. I think the letter scared her. The room seemed to narrow around us, not in a threatening way, but like a house, leaning in to hear its own past. I looked at the envelope again. The seal, once strong, was now cracked but still whole. Whoever closed it had meant for its contents to stay untouched. "Mara," I said, my voice low. "Why did she keep it sealed? Why not read it?" She sat across from me, folding her hands together to still their shaking. "I thought about that," she murmured, over and over. "I even asked myself if she was protecting your secret, or her own." The sentence drifted between us like a slow-moving shadow. She took a breath, sharp, uncertain, before continuing. "She found it years ago, long before I was born, hidden in one of her old things." Her voice grew quieter. "She told me, once, that the past can bite if you wake it." A chill ran through me, thin as a thread. "And when she saw the name written on the front," Mara whispered, "she knew it tied her to someone she didn't want to know." I felt my pulse thrum in my fingertips. Her hands moved again, this time reaching toward the envelope, not to open it but to touch the seal gently. "I think she was afraid," Mara said, "that opening this letter would unravel something she spent her whole life trying to hold together." She lifted her eyes to mine. "And now, here it is, in your home, in my hands." Her voice cracked softly. What truth did she fear enough to leave this untouched? I looked at the sealed letter, untouched for decades, preserved in a silence neither of us fully understood. It rested on the table like a quiet heartbeat, steady and present, waiting. Mara leaned back, her breath unsteady, her hands pale around the memory she didn't mean to carry. The lamp flickered once, casting shifting shadows along the floor. It felt like the room was bracing itself too. I reached toward the envelope but stopped just before my fingers touched it. Some truths require stillness before they allow themselves to be seen. Mara watched me, her eyes wide and uncertain. "We can open it," she whispered, "if you're ready." But readiness wasn't the question. The real question was what waited behind that seal, and why someone long gone had tried so hard to keep it quiet. The room felt different the moment I began to speak, as though the walls leaned in, wanting to hear a name they hadn't heard in decades. Mara sat across from me, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the letter resting untouched on the table between us. The afternoon light slanted through the curtains in thin, dusty strips, laying quiet bars of gold across her shoes, across my hands, across the past I was about to disturb. Names have weight. Some feel like feathers, others fall like stones, and the one she whispered, it dropped straight through every year I'd buried it under. I hadn't spoken about him in years, not because I was hiding the memories, but because the memories had learned to keep themselves quiet. They settled somewhere deep, beneath routines, beneath seasons, beneath the kind of living that leaves no room for old ache. But now the past sat with us, uninvited, in the center of my living room. Mara watched me with a stillness that didn't belong to someone her age. Her eyes held something fragile, fear wrapped in curiosity, sorrow threaded with hope. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush. She simply waited, hands trembling faintly, as though the story I carried had always been meant for her. I took a slow breath. He was complicated, I began. The words felt too small. The lamp hummed softly in the corner, its warm glow settling across the framed photographs on the wall. Photographs he was never in. It struck me then how absence can leave a deeper mark than presence. Mara leaned forward slightly, her hands tightening, the letter brushing against her coat like a quiet reminder of why we were here. "You don't have to say everything at once," she whispered. But she didn't mean it. I could tell. She needed the truth the way people need air when they've held too much inside. I started from the beginning. The simpler years. "We were young," I said softly, "too young to understand what we wanted, and too proud to admit what we feared." The memory unfolded slowly, like an old photograph warming between my fingers. "He came into my life like a storm," I continued, "not loud, not destructive, just sudden, unexpected, a presence that changed the way I breathed." Mara's eyes softened, but her lips pressed into a thin line, bracing herself. "We planned things once," I said. "Futures, homes, a life built on promises spoken under trees instead of roofs. But we were foolish." I paused, feeling the weight of it. Nothing we dreamed had roots strong enough to grow. The wind brushed faintly against the window, lifting the curtain like a sigh. "He left," I said quietly. "No explanation, no goodbye, just gone." Mara's breath hitched. Her fingers brushed the letter unconsciously, as though it pulsed. I watched her face, the sorrow that flickered there, followed by something else, recognition. "When my mother—" She swallowed hard. "When she was slipping, she said his name." The room stilled. She said it like it was the first thing she'd ever loved, and the last thing she regretted, Mara whispered. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of threads tying her mother, him, and me into something neither of us understood yet. Her next words came out so quietly they barely reached me. "She held my hand," Mara whispered, "and she said, 'Tell her I'm sorry.'" My heart tightened. Sorry can mean many things, some too small, some too wide to fit inside a life. I exhaled slowly, searching the room for something steady, the quilt on the chair, the lamp's warm light, the steady tick of the wall clock. But everything felt shifted, as if the past her mother carried had slipped into the air between us. "Why would she say that?" Mara asked, voice trembling. "What did she think you needed to hear?" Her eyes shone with something too tender to name. Fear, maybe, or grief finally finding its shape. I shook my head gently. "I don't know," I said. "But your mother was a good woman. If she kept his name hidden, she believed she had a reason." Mara looked down, gripping her own wrist with the opposite hand, grounding herself. "I always thought she was protecting me," she murmured. "But what if she was protecting you?" The idea settled like dust in a sunbeam, quietly, visibly, without apology. "What if her silence wasn't about shame," Mara whispered, "but about love?" The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls holding their breath, the floorboards remembering footsteps from decades ago. Something in me, something long sealed, shifted. Perhaps her mother wasn't hiding herself. Perhaps she was hiding me. and whatever tied us together through him. I reached out and placed my hand gently over Mara's. Her skin was cool, trembling faintly, like someone standing on the edge of a truth too large to step around. "We'll find the meaning," I said softly, "together." She lifted her eyes, and the grief in them softened into something almost like relief. The letter lay on the table, its seal unbroken, the handwriting a quiet echo from another life. Outside, the light dimmed as a cloud drifted over the sun, shadowing the room in the soft hush of late afternoon, the kind of hush that comes before a revelation. Mara's voice broke the stillness. If she whispered his name while dying, then the story she hid isn't just hers. And the house seemed to agree. The letter lay between us like a small, breathing thing, silent but pulsing with every memory I'd tried not to carry. Mara set it down gently, as if afraid it might tear or shatter or disappear if she touched it too long. Her hands trembled above it, hovering, uncertain, the way someone might hover over a wound they're not ready to uncover. Outside, the winter wind brushed against the house in long, steady sighs, rattling the window pane with a patience that felt almost intentional. We sat in that thin light, facing a truth sealed decades ago in old wax and fading ink. Neither of us knew what waited inside, but the past. It always finds a way to speak. The living room felt colder than before, not from the draft slipping under the front door, but from the kind of cold that settles when two stories finally collide. The lamp beside my husband's old chair cast a soft amber pool across the table, illuminating the envelope in a way that made the script on the front seem to rise up from the paper. My name, written so carefully, so confidently, stared back at me, carrying the weight of someone who had once mattered more than I could admit out loud. Mara sat opposite me, elbows propped on her knees, her breathing shallow. She kept wiping her palms against her jeans, trying to warm herself or calm herself. I couldn't tell which. Her eyes flickered between the seal and my face, as though she feared seeing the truth appear in one before the other. "You don't have to open it," she whispered, but she didn't pull it away. Her hand remained close enough for me to see the outline of the folded letter beneath the envelope. I shook my head gently. "If your mother kept it," I said, "and if he wrote it, then maybe we both do." The wind moaned softly outside, brushing against the house like fingertips against an old door. It felt like the world had paused, waiting for us to move. Mara slid the envelope closer to me, her hands trembling again, not dramatically, but in that quiet, uncontrollable way that comes from fear. "Could you?" she whispered. I nodded, though I wasn't sure my fingers were steady enough either. I picked up the envelope carefully. The paper was delicate, softened by time, the wax seal cracked around the edges, but still holding strong in the center, as though it had fought decades of silence and won. Mara leaned forward, her breath catching. I pressed my thumb lightly against the seal. It didn't budge. So I tried again, a bit more pressure, my hand shaking against the old black wax. This time, the seal gave way with a soft, brittle crack. The sound echoed louder than it should have, sharp as breaking bone, startling both of us. Mara pressed a hand to her mouth. I didn't speak. I slid the folded letter out from inside. The paper was yellowed, edges brittle, the ink slightly smeared in places where the writer's hand had lingered too long. And the handwriting, that familiar, looping script, felt like being pulled backward in time. I unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear it. Mara whispered, "Please, read it." So I did. It wasn't long, just a page and a half, neat lines, steady strokes, and a confession that felt almost too heavy to be held by paper. He wrote of fear, of choices he didn't understand until it was too late, of hurting two people he had never meant to hurt. One out of love, one out of panic. He wrote of a night he could never take back, of a secret that didn't belong to him alone, of a child he never knew, and a woman who walked away carrying the pieces of all three of our lives. My voice shook once but kept going. Mara listened without blinking, her eyes filling slowly, silently like raindrops gathering in the corner of a forgotten window. When I finished, I let the paper rest on the table between us. Neither of us touched it. "So," Mara whispered, her voice barely audible, "he loved you." I nodded once, the motion small. "And my mother." Her voice broke. "She must have known. She must have figured it out. And she kept it." The room felt tighter, as though the walls remembered that story too. "She didn't want me to hate her," Mara murmured, "or hate him or hate you." Her tears fell softly, landing on the floor without a sound. "She was trying to protect your heart," I said gently, "and her own." Mara looked at me, really looked, for the first time since she arrived that morning. "We're connected," she whispered, "aren't we?" The letter lay open between us, its edges trembling slightly from the draft that slipped under the door. The house felt different now, not heavier, not lighter, just more honest, like a story finally told after too many years of silence. Mara wiped her cheeks with her sleeve, her breath unsteady but calmer now. She reached out, touching the corner of the letter with the gentlest fingertip, as if greeting the past rather than fearing it. Outside, the winter wind rattled the window again, not impatient this time, but in a steady rhythm, almost like knocking. I folded the letter carefully, pressing the crease with the flat of my hand. "We're not strangers anymore," I whispered. "Not after this." Mara breathed in slowly, nodding. And for the first time all day, her eyes softened with something that looked a little like hope. The house felt strangely quiet after the letter stopped speaking, not silent. Silence has its own kind of echo. This was different. It was the hush that settles after something sacred has been opened, something that was never meant to be held by daylight. Mara sat beside me, shoulders curled inward, her eyes fixed on the folded pages as though they might move again. The winter wind pressed against the windows, a slow, steady push, like it wanted to come in and listen to what we weren't saying. I could feel the weight of the letter still in the room, heavy as grief, fragile as truth. Inheritance doesn't only come from blood, sometimes it comes from silence. I rested my palms on my knees, grounding myself against the soft fabric of my old house dress. Across from me, Mara rubbed her arms as if she could warm the cold her mother left behind. Her face had softened. No more frantic eyes, no more trembling breath, just a quiet stillness, the kind that follows shock. She reached for the letter again but didn't open it. Her fingers hovered over the seal she had broken with me only moments earlier. "I never understood," she whispered, "why she would drive the long way around this street, why she refused to let me visit you, why she looked afraid whenever your name came up." The words wavered, thin as candle smoke. Now she knew. The letter explained everything. Her mother's disappearance from this house, her sudden, fierce retreat into a life that didn't make space for old connections. It explained the secrets she held so tightly, her whole body learned to bend around them. But explanations don't erase wounds. I watched Mara as she pressed the heel of her hand to her forehead, eyes squeezing shut. "Her fear became mine," she whispered. "I didn't even know it." Sometimes pain gets passed down the way family heirlooms do, wrapped carefully, handed off without instructions. She lowered her hand and looked up at me, her eyes shining with something between regret and understanding. "I panicked this morning," she said softly. "The slap, the shouting, the way I demanded your keys." Her voice cracked on the last word. I could see the moment replaying in her eyes, fear wearing the mask of anger, grief wearing the mask of urgency. "I was scared of what I didn't know," she continued, "and scared of what I might find." Her fingers tightened around the folded letter, the edges pressing into her skin. "I thought, if I could just get in here, just look through the rooms fast enough, I'd—" She stopped, taking a shaky breath. I'd understand why her last words were about him, about you. I nodded slowly. Panic does strange things to people. It pushes them toward the very doors they swore they'd never open. She rested the letter in her lap, tracing a thumb along one of the creases. The ink inside, his handwriting, connected her mother's life to mine with a thread none of us knew existed. It wasn't cruelty, I said softly. Her betrayal, I mean. It came from fear, from wanting to protect what little she thought she could. Mara's shoulders sagged. That's what the letter said, she murmured. She didn't want to lose me, or hurt you, or carry a secret that belonged to all three of you. The room shifted, not physically, but in the way a heart shifts when something hidden is finally acknowledged. Mara leaned back into the sofa, letting her head rest against the cushion, and the exhaustion in her posture felt older than she was. "All my life," she whispered, "I thought she avoided this house because she didn't like you." A small, humorless breath escaped her, the ghost of a laugh. But she was running from the truth she couldn't bear to tell. She looked at me again, her expression open and raw. She carried this alone, all these years. I nodded. "And now you carry it too." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. "Not without it breaking something important." I understood that fear. Truth has a way of pressing against the ribs. Sometimes it breaks them. Sometimes it rebuilds them. "You don't have to decide today," I said gently. "This story belonged to your mother, and to him, and to me. But you're the one who gets to decide how it continues." Her eyes filled again, but not with panic, with something gentler, acceptance, or the beginning of it. "Mara," I said softly, "you apologized for the slap, for the shouting, for the keys." I shook my head. "Fear speaks louder than we want it to." She let out a breath, long, shaky, but freeing. "I'm tired of being afraid," she whispered. The wind rattled the window again, softer this time, almost like a hand tapping gently, reminding us that the world outside was still moving. Mara placed the letter back on the table, smoothing it with her fingertips. Her breathing had steadied, her shoulders had relaxed. "This isn't just your story," she said quietly, "and it isn't just hers." She looked around the room, the photographs, the warm lamp, the quiet house that had held so many unspoken things. "It's ours now," she whispered. I felt something ease inside my chest, a knot loosening after years of holding itself too tightly. But one question lingered, a question neither of us could escape. If the truth had bound our lives together, what would it take to keep it from breaking us apart? The light outside had thinned to the soft blue of late winter, the kind that settles gently over rooftops and fences like a quiet apology. Inside, the house held its breath. The letter lay folded between us on the coffee table, its edges still trembling from all the hands and years it had passed through. Mara and I sat side by side on the sofa, not touching, not speaking, just listening to the faint hum of the heater and the distant groan of branches bending under cold air. It felt like the world had paused so we could catch up to the truth we weren't ready to meet, a truth that now sat calmly between us, waiting to be understood. The room was dim, except for the lamp near my husband's old chair, casting long shadows across the carpet. They stretched toward us like the past reaching for a place to sit. Mara kept her hands pressed together in her lap, thumbs touching lightly, a nervous rhythm pulsing in the soft twitch of her fingers. Every so often she glanced at the folded letter, then looked away again, as if its presence tugged at her, asking her to meet it halfway. I leaned back against the cushion, feeling the weight of the day finally settle into my bones. My cheeks still carried a faint warmth from the slap that morning, though the sting had softened into something else now. Not pain, but memory. Mara let out a slow breath. I was scared, she said softly. Scared that you had answers my mother didn't, or couldn't, or wouldn't face. Her voice trembled in the small space between us. I nodded gently. That kind of fear can twist even simple things, I whispered. When we hurt, the world becomes sharper. Corners cut deeper. Doors look heavier. She swallowed hard, eyes shining in the lamplight. I didn't want to see you as someone who held pieces of her heart, she said, but I did. The words fell between us like snowflakes, quiet, fragile, impossible to gather without melting. Mara shifted closer, her shoulder brushing the fabric of the sofa cushion near mine, but not quite touching. Her breath caught as if she were gathering courage from the air around her, pulling in whatever she needed to say next. I've kept a distance from you for years, she murmured, not because you ever wronged me, but because she taught me to. She paused, her hands opening slightly in her lap, palms facing upward, a gesture that looked both helpless and honest. I thought you were part of something painful she couldn't explain, Mara said, and I thought if I stayed back, I wouldn't inherit whatever hurt lived in this house. Her voice faltered, but it turns out the distance hurt more. I watched her shoulders tremble, the small movements giving away everything she was trying to hold together. The letter sat quietly on the table, folded, patient. She turned toward me, eyes wide with the kind of vulnerability you don't offer lightly. I need to ask you something, she whispered. Not about the past, but about today. I waited. Her voice dropped even softer. Can you forgive me? Not just for this morning, the slap, the shouting, but for every year I stayed away. For every time I believed something unkind about you because she couldn't face her own story? The room held its breath again. Forgiveness, such a simple word on the tongue, but heavy in the hands. I looked at Mara, at the young woman trembling under a history she didn't choose, holding guilt that didn't fully belong to her, carrying a letter written by a man she never met and hidden by a mother she loved more fiercely than she understood. I reached for the letter. The paper felt softer now, warmer, as if the story inside no longer frightened me. Mara, I said, placing the folded pages gently into her hands, forgiveness doesn't start with forgetting. It starts with facing. She looked down at the letter, the corners brushing her fingertips. You came here today carrying fear, I continued, but you're leaving with the truth. That takes courage. She blinked hard, tears catching the light. I hurt you, she whispered. People in pain do, I replied, and people who want to heal ask for forgiveness. Her shoulders sagged as a breath left her, a long, shaking breath that seemed to release a decade of inherited fear. I don't want to be afraid of you anymore, she said. I placed my hand over hers. Light, warm, steady. You never needed to be, I whispered. Her fingers curled gently around the letter, not clinging this time, but holding it with purpose. At that moment, something softened between us, not erased, not forgotten, softened, like ice under the first hint of spring. Outside, the last light of day slipped across the snow, turning it the color of pale lavender. Inside, Mara bowed her head over the letter, her hair falling like a curtain around her face. When she finally looked up, her expression held something new, a fragile calm, the kind that comes only after a long storm. I don't know what happens next, she whispered. Neither did I. But I took her hand again, gently. Maybe forgiveness isn't something we give all at once, I said. Maybe it's something we grow into, together. The house creaked softly, as if agreeing. The snow outside settled into the night, and for the first time in years, the space between us felt open, a clearing in winter, waiting to be walked through. The keys made a soft metallic whisper as they slid across the wooden table, a sound so small, yet it filled the whole room. They stopped just inches from Mara's hands, glinting faintly in the late winter light, like they were waiting for her to decide what to do with them. Dust floated lazily in the air between us, glowing gold in the lamp beside my husband's chair. For the first time all day, the house didn't feel like it was bracing for something. It felt relieved, as if it too had been holding its breath through years of unspoken things and was finally allowed to exhale. Mara stared at the keys as though they held the last piece of a puzzle she'd been building in the dark. Her hands remained folded in her lap, fingers tucked tightly together, knuckles pale. "You can take them," I said quietly, my voice softer than I expected. "Not because you asked for them, because you don't need them anymore." She blinked, her breath catching just slightly. I could feel the air shifting, not dramatically, but in that small, honest way that comes after truth has been spoken aloud. The edges of the room seemed less sharp, the shadows less heavy. Even the carpet felt warmer beneath my feet, as if the weight that had pressed into this house for decades had begun to lift. Mara reached out, but not for the keys. Her fingertips grazed the table's surface instead, tracing the lines in the wood, the little grooves my husband carved by accident over years of setting his coffee down too hard. "This house," she whispered. "It doesn't feel scary anymore." "It never was," I said. "But secrets make strange shapes in the dark." She nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to the keys again. I realized then that they weren't an object of power for her anymore, just a symbol of all the things she no longer had to fear. Mara finally lifted the keys, gently, as if they were breakable. The metal clinked softly against her palm. "I came here thinking you were hiding something from me," she said. "I thought, if I could just get inside, get into the rooms she avoided, I'd find whatever she was running from." Her voice trembled, but only for a moment. "But it turns out," she continued, "the only thing she was hiding from was her own heart." She closed her fingers around the keys and let out a long, shaky breath. "I'm sorry," she said again, this time without panic, without the frantic edge she carried that morning. Just truth, plain and heavy. I watched her eyes move around the room, the photographs, the old quilts, the lamp casting golden light on the walls. I wondered what she saw now that she didn't see before. A home, maybe. Not a secret. Not a wound. Just a home. She stood up slowly as though her legs were remembering how to hold hope. Her coat slipped from her shoulders a little, revealing tiredness but also something lighter. "I want to fix this," she whispered. "With you. With him. With all of it." When she stepped toward the doorway, she paused, one hand on the frame, the other holding the keys loosely at her side. "I'll come back," she said, "and I'll bring him. We should talk. All three of us." Something inside my chest tightened and softened at the same time. My son. The boy who had grown up in these rooms, who knew the sound of every creak in the floorboards, who once believed in laughter before grief made him wary of it. He needed this as much as she did. "Bring him," I said quietly, "when you're ready." Mara nodded, her breath fogging faintly in the cold draft from the front door. "The weather's changing," she murmured, glancing outside. And she was right. The air that seeped through the doorway wasn't biting anymore, not harsh, not sharp, just cold in a way that felt honest, not punishing. She placed the keys on the entry table, not claiming them, not returning them, just setting them somewhere neutral, somewhere shared. Then she turned back to me. "I don't know how to begin," she whispered. "Most beginnings don't feel like beginnings," I said. "They feel like small steps." Her eyes softened. Then today was one, and she stepped out into the fading light. I closed the door behind her, gently the way one closes a book that still has chapters left to read. The house settled with a soft sigh, the floor creaking like an old friend adjusting in its seat. The keys rested on the entry table, catching the last bit of daylight slipping through the glass. For the first time, they didn't feel like something to guard or fear, just keys to a house no longer holding its secrets alone. I pressed my hand against the doorframe, feeling warmth spread through my palm, warmth I hadn't felt here in years. The snow outside glowed faintly as evening gathered. A new quiet filled the room, not heavy, not sad, just open. What new beginning waits when truth finally has a place to live? I stepped deeper into the house, ready to find out.